I don't know if ah
Awesome.
hola, hola. So it's basically it's okay for you to, I mean, like do this discussion in English because we were thinking about like the importance of discussing decolonizing human rights. We did like different reflections this year together with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, New York and Geneva, on the question, the important question of how like a legal instrument created by the liberal order, like the legal liberal order, could be appropriated as well by social movements, mainly in different parts of the world. And how could this instrument be like decolonized precisely to be more useful for social movements and grassroots? So I don't know, if Julian, if you want to start this conversation, and if Mariana would like to participate as well and make this like a general discussion.
Yeah, sure. I think I guess in my opinion, after reading your piece, I definitely wholeheartedly agree with the idea that essentially these rights were conceived by a small handful of countries, and today we speak about them in a way that is very sort of vertically oriented, and sort of these handful of countries appear have discussed and determined that these are rights that should be upheld throughout the world. And then the sort of global South countries that are in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and they just didn't have any voice at the table at this time because they weren't part of the UN. So I definitely agree with that sort of assessment. And I think ultimately, just like after reading your piece, the first thing that came to mind to me was is how different actors in the global South can use these things as just like something to hold up directly to the people they're lobbying towards as something that, hey, this is not something that we came up with. This is something that you came up with and are not upholding today. So just like a very sort of basic understanding of your piece after reading it briefly, I think is that it's definitely something that should be including voices in the global South to reinterpret what human rights are from a legal standpoint, and why these legal sort of arguments seem to uphold in some places, and then are just like totally disregarded when we talk about the global South. So, yeah, that was just my initial interpretation after reading it. Wholeheartedly agree. I don't know if Mariana has similar thoughts or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, yes. I will agree with your point. I think something very interesting to think about how to conceive the declaration in a epistemic way differently. For me, it has been very interesting to follow at the UN the conversations of indigenous peoples, human rights groups, right, and the way they are pointing out at the concepts and conceptions of life and of society from a completely different standpoint. But they in the discussion inside the UN, of course there are many groups that choose not to work with these instruments and with this very institutionalized Western sort of international legal infrastructure. But I think it's very, very interesting to look at how indigenous people's rights groups are able to add, to put input into thinking in a collective way, thinking, I mean, all of these concepts that really stay away from this individualistic nature of human rights, and to think about collective rights in this context. And I think that's a discussion that is very important. I mean, to add and a struggle that I think it's very also interesting to follow and to learn from it. This idea of like inserting, bringing forward these very radical ideas for the Western mind into this infrastructure, this architecture of human rights that has been created in a completely different world.
So a question I sort of had I don't know if Alejandro, if you want to go, I don't want to step on your toes, but maybe just a question to pose to the group here is, it seems like one of the main hurdles to having these rights upheld is that there's no real body, international body, where the laws can be both interpreted and ruled upon, that is that all these countries are accountable to. So when you do have rulings and different legal arguments that are accepted and ruled upon in favor of indigenous people or minorities, in certain places, there's actually nothing to hold any sort of government accountable, if they aren't upholding those rights. So do you think there's any space? I'm not sure if states would agree to something like this, because it would sort of open them up to all the legal challenges which they've been ignoring over the last 70 years. So do you think there's space for conversation around some sort of international legal body that could make these decisions, and that countries would respect them, states would respect the decisions made in this court, when it comes to the violations of these different human rights?
You want to go first, Alejo?
Okay, yeah. Maybe I think that maybe it's very hard to think that it's going to be ensemble some kind of body to interpret and apply the Declaration of Human Rights. Maybe the importance of this instrument is how it can be applied in every context, for the organization of that context. In Colombia, the experience in Colombia, the Constitutional Court commonly used the Declaration of Human Rights for as a symbolic instrument, as an interpretation, as a hermeneutical piece tool to use to apply in the specific context of minority groups. In the case of LGBTQI people, the Constitutional Court has used the Declaration of Human Rights in its terms of the equality and non-discrimination principle, specifically to apply in it to, apart from the formal equality of this principle, applying it to the specific context of violations of human rights in LGBTQI specifics, by specific needs. I think it's very hard to think in this moment to think a body to that the United Nations creating a new body to interpret a new court that apply the human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights. Maybe we can work in applying it in every context, but by the national courts as the Constitutional Court in Colombia. That's what I think about this matter, because I think it's very far the possibility to think a body, a specific instrument, a specific court that applies the Declaration of Human Rights.
What I want to say as well, it's somewhat related to your question. It's not a direct answer, a direct response to your question, but I think it's also relevant to know that the Declaration of Human Rights, I mean, from the point of view, like of political and legal realism, it was also conceived as a geopolitical tool. Like back in history, if we go back in history, the Declaration of Human Rights was the legal framework of the liberal order after the Second World War, and like during all the years of the Cold War, the Declaration of Human Rights became like the head of the legal order established by the liberal order, by the Western Bloc. And like there are many interesting analyses in which like many researchers and like lawyers compare, for example, this legal order like determined by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the legal order like created by the other bloc, by the Soviet Union, like the bloc of social, cultural and economic rights, economic, social and cultural rights. And how these blocks started to compete. And for example, it's very interesting that the social movements, like a lot of social movements during all the time of the Cold War, they didn't appropriate first the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because they were seeing in it like an instrument of the liberal order, of a humanitarian kind of solidarity, which was absolutely depoliticized. I mean, it wasn't politicized for the sake of the social movements, but for the sake of the liberal order and their interest in countries in Latin America, in Africa, and somewhere else. And then we start seeing that towards the 70s, there's a discourse that starts changing a little bit among many social movements, particularly in Latin America, in which they say, okay, this is not a legal battle. We can also use that instrument, and we can appropriate that instrument, even though it was created like by the Western Bloc from the point of view of humanitarian solidarity, like from a hierarchical solidarity point of view. And many social movements started appropriating as well this instrument, but of course, it wasn't easily appropriable. I don't know if you can say that in English. I mean, it wasn't easy to appropriate it, precisely because, like, as I mentioned it in the article, like the philosophical point of view, the onto-epistemological point of view of the declaration was necessarily a Western one. So for many social movements in the global South, it was very hard, like, to take it down, like to take the declaration down from the onto-epistemological heavens of the liberal order and the Western Bloc, to the realities in which, like, for many of them, the core concept of dignity, for example, it didn't have the same sense as for the lawyers and all the personalities that participate in the creation of the Declaration of Human Rights. For example, in Latin America, the concept of dignity was interpreted for many social movements, indigenous, Black social movements, feminist social movements, from the point of view of concepts as el buen vivir, good living. I don't know if you can translate that in that way. I don't think so, but el buen vivir, for example. And that's a completely different concept of the one of dignity consecrated by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So many of these aspects, also, for example, the onto-epistemological view of who can be a subject, of who can be a subject, like this is very well defined as well in the liberal legal order. And for example, right now we can see that at least in Colombia, like many different entities, non-human entities, have been considered as subjects. Now we talk, for example, of the rights of the rivers, of the rights of, for example, animals within the household, and all that are innovations that were not part of the epistemological point of view that gave birth to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I think we have to see also, like, in these differences, the ground of geopolitical interests as well, because defining reality and the ways of defining reality are the first step for defining rights, and for defining the way of fighting for rights, and like, yeah, claiming rights and being entitled to claim rights.
Yeah, I think honestly what you just said there reminds me of, and it's a similar situation, I guess, since we're in New York, just to speak of the American context. So many things in America are challenged under the idea of, is it in the Constitution? And then there's this question of, well, if it is in the Constitution, what did the founding writers mean when they wrote it? So you're trying to interpret this document that is hundreds of years old and apply it to today. And there's sort of pushback from conservative groups and different groups that basically say, if it is not explicitly written in the Constitution, it is not deserving of rights, essentially. Like, so different groups aren't necessarily mentioned in the Constitution. It's spoken about as like sort of land owning white men. So when we talk about what you're entitled to in the US, there's even a question of, well, it depends on who's you're asking, because half, or not half, but there's a large portion of people who might have this interpretation that if you aren't one of the people who are explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, then any sort of interpretation of your rights is an extra. It's not something that is is codified into the Constitution. So therefore, it is up for debate or question. And similarly, I think when we talk about like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with how many countries are excluded in that conversation, to then try and take that document and apply it to your own local context, you need to have an interpretation that is different from necessarily what the founders of that document said in the United Kingdom or the United States or even France. So yeah, I think that's a very like interesting and obviously the most important point when we talk about any sort of legal document is like, well, what is the framework for this legal document? Who does it cover? And then when those people aren't explicitly covered, how do we determine exactly how they fit into this document? And I think most of us would agree that obviously none of these documents are living, or they are living documents when we try to interpret them today. But without having the people who wrote those documents, it's up to us to interpret those and apply them applicably across the board to everybody. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I guess at this point, I guess we can continue the conversation on decolonizing human rights and the different contexts within that. Or it's up to you if you want to pivot to the video from Anya Rebri and have that discussion on some people who I think when we talk about human rights, we talk about Rojava and the Kurdish people. I think it's a great example of people that live on different sides of different borders. So they have different interpretations legally that are placed upon them from whether it be Turkey or Syria or Iran, Iraq. So there's a question of what is the legal framework that they're working with there today currently, and what is the universal application? How do they sort of apply the universal aspects of human rights beyond those different states? Because as a minority group, Kurds are often sort of excluded from the sort of states' rights that are granted to all civilians. So I don't know if you want to pivot to that. And
you got muted.
Oh, sorry. I could pull up Anya's bio just before we play that, just so the audience has an idea of who's about to speak. So Anya Rebri is a New York-based researcher and journalist focusing on the Kurdish movement in Syria and Turkey, and indigenous movements in Mexico. Her writing has appeared in The Nation, Jacobin, Truth Out, Open Democracy, and other outlets. And she's also on the steering committee of the Emergency Committee for Rojava. And I'll share some links to some of her writings so viewers can have a look at these as they watch the video.
Okay, so I don't know if like before playing the video, Mariana and Alejo would like to say like a last reflection, maybe in 7 minutes, because we have like in small 7 minutes to keep to keep the recordings hour by hour. So if maybe in these last 6 minutes you wanted like to maybe Mariana and Alejandro to say a last word about this discussion we were having together.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I stay with the question of Julian, and I think like talking about accountability, I so much agree with you, Esteban, saying that the declaration is a geopolitical tool. And I think accountability it's a political process, like we can believe in an objective justice, but this is not a reality in the ground or ever in practice. And I think it's very, very obvious and like that's just very obvious how it will, in this system that we have today, it will be impossible to think about making countries accountable for this. I mean, the clear example is like countries like the US, Israel don't join the Statute of Rome, and so then cannot be trial for crimes against humanity and things like this. I think it's very obvious how easy it is for states to politically navigate these spaces, because there's no need for them to join or not. And I think also inside the states themselves, I mean, accountability inside the states and the possibility for movements to make use of for example, human rights language and tools inside their own struggles. It really depends in the political climate and the possibilities that there are in that country. I mean, I think, I mean, I come from Argentina, and I would say, like, yes, the trials against the military junta in the 80s, you know, it was a very particular way of seeing that, you know, after recovering democracy. And this was such an important moment that really frame, I mean, I grew up in the 80s, 90s, you know, really frame us into that. And I think today that we're seeing like that democracy is eroding, that the far right is getting to leadership spaces. I think we are in a completely different, you know, moment for, and this consensus on human rights that we used to have, like it's eroded. I wouldn't say it's not there, but you know, it's much more weaker than it used to be. So I think yeah, it's I think Julian said it should be a living document, and it needs to be reactualized, you know, by each group, by each political moment, and etc. Yeah.
And Alejo, your last words. Last words.
My last words. By this matter, my criteria is that the way to seek decolonization is through the application of the pro persona principle and the understanding of these instruments as living instruments. And this necessarily involves listening to and encouraging the effective participation of minority groups to seek the protection of their rights by the specific look of the matter. That's my final thing to say. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you. So Julian, it's all to you.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna drop in the chat real quick some different links to Anya's work. So this next topic, as we pivot, as I just said, Anya Rebri covers different women's movements both in Turkey and Syria and in Mexico. So when we talk about the rights of women, I think oftentimes it's unfortunately the burden is placed upon women, and different organizations catered around women to fight for their own rights because they're often excluded from the conversation and rights-making conversation, especially at the different state levels throughout the world. So I'm just gonna drop some different links to the different movements, women's movements, both in Syria, Turkey, Rojava, and in Mexico as well. So yeah. Should I share my screen and start the video?
Yeah, it's the video. I can share it as well if you want.
Okay, yeah.
It's the 47-minute video, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just share.